Hello everyone. Hello. Good to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Anna. I'm one of the co-creators here on Savouring the Indo-Caribbean. And I'm so glad to be here tonight with everyone. We're going to be welcoming a special guest, Ramsawakh, who is a producer, storyteller. They are hilarious, and I'm so excited to have them join us today. We are both co-authors on Two Times Removed, and we've been doing a series here on Savouring where we explore identity, culture, preservation of Indo-Caribbean heritage through the story, one of the stories in the book, Karila, written by me. And so we're going to be exploring various topics with regards to Indo-Caribbean identity from the lens of underrepresented identities and other marginalized communities. So I'll be joined by Dev, and I'm so glad for everyone to meet them. They are hilarious, as I mentioned before. If you haven't followed them already, I think that you should. You'll definitely get a laugh every time they post. So I'm excited to welcome them. And before I do, though, I just wanted to acknowledge some of these conversations. They can be difficult, but they're very necessary. And I just want to acknowledge the labor that some of our community members have to go through in telling their stories and reliving some of the experiences that they've had within the community or outside of the community, and just hold space for that. The fact that they have to do this for us to help us learn, and they do it with their whole heart, and it's not easy. So we thank them, and I'm so glad to have some of these tough conversations on Savouring, and I think that overall, I think they've been really making an impact within the community. So we're glad to be here, and I'm going to have Dev join us now. And if you have any questions at any point throughout the live, please drop them in the comments, and we'll be sure to get to them. So I'm going to ask. Hopefully that worked. Dev!
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm going to change my camera so I fit better in this. Dev, thank you so much for being here, for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you. We are divinely connected through our stories and Two Times Removed, and I'm so glad to have you here speaking with us today.
I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited about all these conversations you've been having and are continuing to have. It's all really exciting stuff.
Awesome. So before we begin, we should probably let everyone know the genesis of this conversation and a little bit more about Two Times Removed. So on Savouring here, we've sort of had these conversations through identity and culture through the lens of the symbolism included in one of the stories called Karila, which I wrote. And many of these stories explore, there's 16 stories actually, I should put it up here, 16 stories written by Indo-Caribbean writers, and they explore identity, culture, everyday struggle, and it's an amazing collection of stories. And in here, I wrote Karila, and Dev wrote Cups of Tea. So we'll be hearing more about Cups of Tea soon. But before we begin, Dev, I wanted to read a bio of you, just to let everybody know how amazing you are. So Dev Ramsawakh is a disabled, non-binary Indo-Caribbean Canadian multidisciplinary producer whose work focuses on their intersecting identities. They write creative nonfiction, fiction, and journalism. They're also a podcaster, filmmaker, model, and horror aficionado. I know I was going to mess this word up. Aficionado. They've been published in CBC, Extra, Post Canada, and other publications. Well accomplished, Dev. Again, thank you for being here. And before we begin, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and anything that's not included in the biography here, and then tell us a little bit more about Cups of Tea.
Yeah, I feel like my bio covers pretty much everything, but yeah, I call myself a multidisciplinary producer because I work in pretty much if you give me a storytelling medium, I will figure out a way to use it. So podcasting, filmmaking, stories, poetry, uh, journalism, I've just kind of go wherever it takes me. I identify as gender fluid specifically, so uh, I don't really have like a fixed sense of gender. I think is some context here that some folks might need, so that's why I use they, them pronouns. Um, and yeah, I have spina bifida, ADHD. I'm self-diagnosed autistic, so lots of identities and labels and things going on here. But yeah, sorry, did you ask me to go into cups of tea as
Yeah, but
well? Yeah.
before you tell us about Cups of Tea, we have to know what your favorite Indo-Caribbean dish is. So why don't you tell us that?
Um,
You can have more than
hmm. I do have more than one. I'm gonna shout out two, because I'm Guyanese and Trini, so I gotta give one for my mom, one for my dad. So especially this time of year, I feel like everybody knows about it. I don't know if it has an actual name. We just call it pumpkin in my house, where you like stew up the pumpkin. I don't know. It's pumpkin, and you eat it with roti. I think you posted about it recently. Is a delight. I once dated a non-Caribbean partner, and when his dad asked to bring like a cultural dish to dinner, and I was like, I don't know what that was it. That was what I brought.
okay.
Um, and my second one is, of course, from Guyana. And we are coming up on the holiday season, so I know we're all preparing for it. Is pepper pot is I wait around all year for a pepper pot. Is the I'm actually estranged from my dad, but my mom acts as a go-between for me so I can get my pepper pot every year because it's honestly the only thing that makes me come back.
So good. And I was actually just talking to I was coordinating, the Christmas dinner. And so yes, pepper pot's on our list too. So is black cake, if anybody here has black cake for Christmas, and so is fruit cake on the list. So it's such a good time, Christmas, because we get to enjoy our foods. And it's nice. It's nice. It's a nice I think it's a nice thing that we incorporate culture into Christmas, which is nice.
Yeah.
So yes, so in Two Times Removed, you wrote a story called Cups of Tea, and I wrote a story called Karila. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about Cups of Tea?
Sure. So cups of tea sort of is this exploration of these like parallels between multiple generations of Indo-Caribbean women, and it's sort of told in these conversations told over cups of tea um, that the main character Nadia has with her mother and grandmother, and this is all in the aftermath of leaving an abusive relationship. And this is sort of based off of personal experience a little bit in terms of having these conversations with my mom and my grandma, and hearing a lot of echoes of experiences that they had and a lot of things that they learned growing up, that actually were things that I experienced, but these are all those like things that we don't talk about, growing up. It's like, Indo-Caribbean moms, it's like nothing happened before you were born. I didn't exist before you were born. We don't need to talk about it. I'm just your mom and that's it. And yeah, finding out that, and being a kid, you don't really talk about what's actually happening in your life to your parents, because you're afraid you're gonna get in trouble or whatever, especially if it's things that are like not so great that are happening in your life. And so as an adult, to go back and have those conversations later is very much like, oh, you also went through that? Like, I sort of wish we talked about this earlier, so maybe I could have like sidestep that a little bit, or like maybe listen to your advice a little bit more, because then I knew it was coming from experience and not just this, motherness.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated with me, is how we're not able to really have these open dialogues with our parents, right? And so that really just that perpetuates this feeling of shame that we can't even discuss it sometimes in our broader community. And so what I'm finding interesting right now is that some of us feel more comfortable having these spaces where we can share, what's on our mind and how we feel about culture, how we feel about who we are as individuals. And so it's really great to have these spaces. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading Cups of Tea. And this entire book, honestly, was such a gift. So one of the stories in here is Karila, and here's where we're going to get into how we're going to segue into some of our conversations around identity and culture. I wrote Karila, which is it's a story of love, resilience, and symbolism, and it stretches over 3 generations. It starts with the generation migrating over to Canada. And then it's the setting of a teenage girl trying to navigate her Indo-Caribbeanness and, being a teenager, just trying to be a teenager, forget identity for a second, right? And then it goes into her children, so the generation after. And so in the story, at the end, the main character's daughter gets a book, and it's a recipe book filled with a whole bunch of Indo-Caribbean recipes. And I think, in essence, this alone is quite amazing. And I think it's something for us all to consider when it comes, at least for me, it's on top of my mind to figure out how we can, how we can preserve and how we can pass down some of these, some of these dishes. And so, of course, giving your daughter a recipe book is probably, I wish my mom gave me a recipe book. That would save so much time. But I digress. So in the book, it's a collection of recipes, and one of the recipes, one of the dishes, her daughter doesn't recognize, and it's Karila. And so in the story, that at the beginning of the story, the main character, Celicia, hates Karila. So obviously she never cooked it in her home. Her daughter's not familiar with it. So this all to say that this recipe book, and the title is called Karila because it's actually quite symbolic of how I sort of reconciled and negotiated my identity in some ways. So the recipe book being a collection of Indo-Caribbean identities and rituals and, behaviors that I associated being Indo-Caribbean. And some of which were Karilas, which are things that, I didn't want, I didn't like. I didn't want to have it in my home. I didn't want it to be a part of my identity. So all this to say that it's really symbolic, this recipe book. And it is a reflection of sort of what I've had to go through as a teenager in terms of navigating identity, because I did come from a home and a community that had a lot of Indo-Caribbean people. And so there were just some things, Dev, that, I just couldn't. And so you go through this process of, am I Guyanese enough then if I don't associate this way, or if I don't act this way? So I negotiated my identity. And I think this is one of the things that maybe some of us go through. Some of us are estranged from our identity. So long-winded story, but what I really want to know from you, that was sort of my experience. And I wanted to know from you, growing up as a teenager, how did you navigate your identity as an Indo-Caribbean person?
So for me, I was like very disconnected from Indo-Caribbean culture in my teens, for sure. ran away from it as far as I could. I felt like, I was very much like, oh, I don't really think I want to be a part of this. And a lot of that was because, one, I didn't really know how I fit into like Caribbean culture as a whole. I grew up in the suburbs outside of Toronto, and I know there are other Indo-Caribbean people there. Looking back, there's a lot of last names. There's, like Chet Rumbach, Ramatar. Like, I was like, oh, they were there. But it wasn't a thing that people spoke about very much. And so I didn't really have any associations with Indo-Caribbeans other than my family. And something my family did a lot growing up was when there was something that they did or said that they didn't really want to analyze too much or, reflect on too much, that I would be asking questions about or pushing back against, they would just sort of go, oh, well, that's the culture, or that's just how it is back home or whatever. And it is very interesting because when my parents came here relatively young themselves, like they were, like my dad was barely an adult when he got here. My mom was a kid. And so it's very much like, do they even know what it's like back home right now? Like, what are people saying and doing back home? Like, how much do they know? But at the time as a teenager, you're not really thinking that way. You're just going like, well, if that's the culture, then I don't really want to be a part of this culture. And there was maybe one other person I went to high school with who I absolutely knew was Indo-Caribbean. They were Guyanese, and they were also very like outcasty, weird. I was always like a weirdo in school. So, we were the anime kids, before being an anime kid was sort of like a norm that is accepted now. It was like, oh, you watch what? Okay. And like having to like hide mangas at my house because her parents were like much more they saw that as like a witchcraft, and then like that's the devil's work right there. And so like, yeah, I'd be like hiding her mangas at my house and stuff like that. But aside from that, I didn't really have anyone to be like, oh, that's what it means to be Guyanese, that's what it means to be Trini. I really didn't meet anyone. I was actually like, aside from that one friend, who, yeah, was like Trini or Guyanese up until I was like most of the way through university. And I know like there's tons and they're out there. It's just like it's so hard to find each other sometimes, especially in these like sub communities, where, yeah, you're like the weirdos and freaks, even in your like community outside of the Indo-Caribbean community. And so it was just like, yeah, I was very disconnected and very much like, well, if, a wife doing the dishes for her husband is just like what it's like back home. Like, I don't want that life. So I'm not really going to identify with being Caribbean. And so now, as an adult, I'm sad about it. I'm like, oh, there's so much like food and music and all of this stuff that I kind of hid myself from and refused to engage with that, I'm finding now, and it's like, oh, my whole life could have just been better this whole time if I, but definitely not having folks around me that reflected a similar reality to me was probably the hardest part, navigating.
And I think that's the experience of so many people outside of, especially if you're in these smaller communities outside of Toronto. It's really difficult to find groups, especially within, other marginalized groups, as you were mentioning. And so one of the things that you said during our talk was that there were things that you know, you were hearing about the culture, about your parents and from your parents, and you're like, well, I don't actually, then I don't, you know, I don't want to associate myself then with
Mm-hmm.
the Guyanese and, you know, or Trini or whatever the case may be. And so these are my Karilas as well. Like this is the symbolism that we're here talking about. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned doing the dishes. So I'm assuming gender roles is one of your Karilas. Like tell me a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about some of your Karilas and some of those things you were like, irks.
Ye-
No.
Yeah, I mean, I was a very outspoken kid. I mean, I don't think you can grow up in a West Indian household and not pick that up in some way. Um, but there were, and this might just be like me being autistic, but there was a lot of times where you're just supposed to accept things about how people move about the world when you're a kid that I often just didn't do. I'd be like, why do people do that? Why is this happening? And so, yeah, conversations about gender roles, about the expectations of like having kids, getting married, or what kind of career you're supposed to have. I would always be questioning that, and like that was not appreciated, especially at family functions. And so uh, they like, yeah, I would be like at parties, and there would be things like my father would say something disrespectful to my mother in front of me, and I would get mad about it and be like, that's not okay to say. But then, like, aunts and uncles around me would be like, you can't say that. That's your elder. You don't talk to your father like that. You know, that's just not right. And there would be stuff like, yeah, like using aggression or violence or whatever when you're angry as a response to something would just be like, oh, well, you know, like that's how parents handle things back home. And it'd be like, well, we clearly know that's a problem, you know, like, you know, you came to this country for a reason, right? You know, you were like, some things aren't actually fitting for me. And like, you don't really have the excuse of being like, well, back home we do it this way, where it's like, you do see that there are other ways to bring up kids. And even within like our own communities here, like I do think there's a lot of people, and I can only speak to the diaspora, because yeah, I don't have much connection to what it's like actually back home. But you know, like I know that there are a lot of like Indo-Caribbean parents who are like trying to do things differently and trying to like learn from how they wish their parents had treated them. And so it's very much like I know that work is happening in our communities and like we are doing that. It's just like I feel like a lot of the times it gets swept under the rug as like, oh, that's like a white people thing to do, you know? Like that's what white people do. And it's like sometimes it's like that's not even what white people are doing. We're asking you to not even do what they're doing, but it's yeah, and so a lot of things would just be like, and even just like queerness would just be like, it was not even a question about whether or not, you know, we could be queer because, you know, we were brown. We couldn't possibly be queer, despite the fact that, you know, I feel like there's so many queer brown folks out there, and just like brown culture itself has a lot of queerness to it in ways. Um, but yeah, there would just be like a lot of like, oh, that's like a white people thing. You know, white people go off and be gay, but you know, we don't do that. And it was very much like, but why not? Like,
And it's really interesting that you bring this up because you also mentioned your family had come over when they were quite young. Your dad was in his teens, your mom was young, and so I imagine me being their daughter as well, kind of having the same thoughts as you were having. Is like, how do you know that, right? And I think one of the things that we've become accustomed to is like overgeneralizing how our experience is only our experience. You know, some
mhm,
of these you know, the gender roles, they are apparent in many different other cultures as well. And so we obviously put an Indo-Caribbean lens on it. And I think it's really great how you mentioned that some of these things, you know, are just for us to be better people, right? It's not about being white. And I heard that a lot too. Like, oh, that's too white, or that food is white, or you're not supposed to wear this, you look so white. And it's like, let me live. Like, actually just let me live, right? And so I'm wondering from you, in terms of, you know, identifying as transgender, queer, how did that sort of, if we kind of focus in that direction, like how did that affect your identity?
Yeah, so I didn't even have the language for my gender until my 20s. And so for the longest time, I always just considered myself like a tomboy kind of figure. And that kind of like worked fine with my family. To be honest, like my mother had an easier time taking woman out of her vocabulary before I came out as trans than after. It was just be like, Mom, don't call me lady, you know, like I don't really jive with that. And she would just be like, oh yeah, you don't really act like one anyways, so that makes sense. And it would just be like, oh yeah. And but what was really interesting was it wasn't really until I met other like Caribbean and specifically like Indo-Caribbean non-binary folks and trans folks um, who, yeah, were openly identifying as trans or non-binary, that I started to be able to feel comfortable using the labels for myself. It was sort of like, oh yeah, like that can be a thing for me, you know? And having that representation was just like, oh, like that's what transness can look like. That's what that experience can like feel like. And having those conversations with other people uh, as well, and just like hearing what it was like growing up for them, dealing with gender roles and things like that. It was very much like, oh yeah, actually, this does fit into my experience. And so that was a huge, like, yeah, just having other trans Indo-Caribbean folks around me was like a major, major thing for me. And it's like, yeah, the more that I find, the more that I'm like, oh, I need more of you in my life. Um, Disability, I think, was actually the tougher thing to navigate with identity. I had felt like a lot of Indo-Caribbean culture was like based really around these like party spaces and like sets and like, you know, part like even as a child, my parents would be partying until like 3, 4, 5 in the morning sometimes, you know. Um, yeah, for special events, obviously not for all the time, but they definitely knew how to party hard, and it's all dancing, it's music blasting all night long, you know. If people are sitting around, it's for the chit chat and whatever, but it's for the rest before you hit back out on the floor, or you're an old person, you know. And then you're there with the tea, with the cake while everyone parties downstairs, you know. And so it was very much as I love dancing and I love music and I love being in dark spaces, just like grooving. That was the most old person way to say that I could, but uh, but as much as I love being a part of that, sometimes it was very much like I can't always do that. And even finding spaces in Toronto, a lot of like Caribbean spaces, specifically for like queer folks and things like that, are still based around these like party spaces. And part of that, you know, is also just a problem in the queer community. A lot of it is club culture, party culture. But not being able to feel confident about accessing those spaces and then being able to like move around them once I'm inside, go to the bathroom, you know, all of those things. Or if it's sort of like, do I have to be careful about how much I drink? Because if there's going to be stairs, I have to be even extra careful because like I could really take a tumble. Because yeah, like one of my ankles is just like, uh, it has some paralysis, so I like my foot's sort of just flopping around sometimes. And it can be very hard to navigate those spaces and enter those spaces, and, you know, stick around for a while and actually meet folks and get to know people. And so, yeah, I do find even now it can be very, once things became virtual for the pandemic, it actually became a lot easier to meet folks because everyone was online now. And it was like, oh, okay, I can just like video chat you or whatever, and we can just like have a conversation or like just share music with each other or whatever. But yeah, pre-pandemic, it was very much like, oh, everyone's congregating at, you know, the party over at that club or whatever, or at that bar, and it's like once in a while that is really great, and like I think those spaces are very valuable, and like obviously partying has like its value for us, but having it be one of the only ways to like congregate and like meet each other has been very difficult, to yeah, be in community and feel that connectedness.
Yeah, and I can imagine like in terms of having, you know, your social environment must be very different. And tell me a little bit more about, you know, has this affected some of your friendships within the Indo-Caribbean community, outside the Indo-Caribbean community? Like how has having a disability affected friendships for you?
I found that it's made it a lot easier to connect with other disabled Indo-Caribbean and just any kind of Caribbean folks. I ended up being introduced to Courage Bacchus, who is a great like athlete and artist, a deaf artist who does amazing work. Gaitra Prasad, also a deaf artist, and Indo-Caribbean, like being able to get introduced to their work was like super moving. Jasmine Noseworthy Prasad also, you know, like getting to get connected with these folks actually was super like heartwarming for me and just like an incredible experience. And being able to find folks who are like, yeah, I really love all these things, but I'm not always like up for them, but like we can definitely, you know, like share food or maybe like find another way to connect over these things. Like right now, like Jumbie stories are the thing that's connecting us. And you know, like as I've mentioned, Jasmine Noseworthy Prasad does this art, you know, was doing art on like Kalapani and all of these things. And it's just like finding those folks was all worth like having that trouble navigating finding folks, because it was like once I found them, it was like those connections were like they're so invaluable, like can't even describe.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And so you mentioned Jumbie story. So if anyone hasn't listened to Jumbie Podcast yet, I highly recommend it. I've listened, and so I thoroughly enjoyed this, Dev. And just listening to the stories, Cliff's story, for example, like just being able to relate to the language, you know, the rituals, for example, throughout the story. No spoilers, but in the story, you know, the main character is running back from the forest and thinking a Jumbie's following them, and so throws salt over their shoulder. And so this is a quintessential ritual that a lot of Indo-Caribbean, a lot of Caribbean people will know of, you know, throwing salt or lining salt outside your door. So, you know, Jumbie or Duppy or Spirit, however you want to call it, won't follow you and won't grab hold of you. So if anyone hasn't listened to that yet, I think it would be really valuable just to connect with culture in this really like really different way. You know, we're used to reading about culture through like historical facts, and like, so it's just this nonfiction way to connect with culture, which I found really, really beautiful. And so I'm so glad, I'm so thankful to you, Dev, and to the team at Jumbie Podcast for putting this together, because I think it's one of the ways that all of us start to feel a little bit more connected to our culture. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you for shouting it out for me. And Just so folks know, our next episode is on Wednesday, and it's going to have Ryan Prasadi or Tifa Wine. Tifa is a drag artist, also an academic scholar in like Caribbean feminisms. They do this photo series called Kuliween, Tifa.wine on Instagram. Definitely follow them, check out their work. They're doing a whole thing right now around Kuliween. And now my cat has decided that it is her time for attention, so you might hear some cat yells in the background. But yeah,
we're here for it.
Ryan is Chinny, also going to be talking about the trial. It's such a good conversation. So yeah, definitely check it out.
Amazing. Shabita said, sounds amazing. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to the podcast. Thank you. Vinay gave us some hearts. We've got some claps. Thank you all so much for being here and joining us. So that before we get into preservation and sort of into that conversation, I wanted to know a little bit more about how your identity as an Indo-Caribbean person, as an underrepresented Indo-Caribbean person, how does that affect your work as a storyteller, as a producer, as a creator?
I mean, it's hard to say in terms of it affects it in such a like a holistic way. Like there's nothing in my life my identities don't touch in some way, whether it's food, how I communicate, who my friends are, like it all very impacted. But with my work specifically, it's mostly I often am aware of conversations that are being had in these like very like niche communities. Like trans Caribbeans and Toronto diaspora is like pretty hyper niche, but there's a lot of important conversations that are happening in these spaces. And so there's a lot of times where I am just trying to get folks to pay attention to them, and it can be very difficult to be like, can you like pay attention to this very like, it seems niche, but it really impacts everybody, I promise you. And sort of getting people to like pay attention and be like, oh, what do those things have to do with me? Kind of a thing. And most of the time, all that it is my identities just often give me a perspective of just how we treat certain individuals and how certain systems impact us. Just because I do get to experience firsthand how like ableism, how racism, how homophobia and transphobia and patriarchy and all of the things come together to keep people from expressing themselves or living their best life. And yeah, it can be very frustrating because it feels like I have access to all of these important, amazing conversations and amazing people who are doing work in these spaces. But it's so hard to get people to pay attention and be like, yes, this is important beyond this specific group. Like they're talking about things that impact us all. And yeah, I think that's sort of like the biggest impact it has on my work.
Yeah, and I thank you for doing that work of putting out these stories, because I think it's really important for us to hear stories that are different from ours, from people from diverse cultures, diverse identities. And I think overall it just makes us better people, right? It makes us more inclusive, it makes us more compassionate, it makes us more, it allows us to see our oneness with everyone, right? And so I'm grateful for storytellers like you and that take the time and take the effort to put these together, even knowing that, you're fighting to be seen, you're fighting to be heard, and you still continue to do the work that you do. So I thank you. And any way that Savouring can support you, we're here for it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about preservation of Indo-Caribbean culture. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that you're starting to learn a little bit more about it, being more about, including more about some of these things that your family had originally, told you it was about. And so you're exploring music and all the history and things like that. So talk to me a little bit more about that journey of you sort of reconnecting, or where you are on that journey. And in terms of what you're learning, and you're like, I need to keep this. I need to keep this and share it with whoever, whenever. So talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think your story, Corral, is such a great example of that experience, because for me, that one connection I really hung through all of the turbulence of identity navigation, was food. A good West Indian curry is one of the greatest things in the world, and specifically the kind that your mom makes, how there's that specific flavor that only your mom makes, and you can't go to the store, and you can't even go to Jupiter's or something, and be like, give me this curry, this is gonna taste like home or whatever. It's not. So my first kind of entry point into reconnecting was once I moved out. I no longer had this unlimited source of curry and stew and pumpkin and all of the things downstairs. I now had to call my mom and have her drive to me, and now it's a whole thing where now we have to have a conversation, and
I can't just get the food and go.
You can't just come downstairs, grab the food, eat it real quick, and then run back up to the computer, and so it was I had to start learning how to cook it myself, and I'm not great at it. I am still trying to figure out how to get it to taste like my mom's, but one saving grace is the fact that my mom is still also sometimes she'll be like, I don't know what I did, but I cooked curry and it don't taste right. And I'll be like, how are you supposed to help me then if you don't know how to cook your own curry? But so food was a major thing for me, and it would be going out to eat with friends and stuff would be great, but it would be no, I do just want some curry chicken, with the potatoes and the all of that, and the roti, even the dal puri. I'm not a dal puri fan, to be honest. I know everyone's all about the puri, but it's messy, and I'm not about that. But sometimes it's I'll even have some dal puri right now. That would just make me feel so good. And so finding places around the city where I could even just find something similar or close, Island Foods and Liberty Village is when I found that, and they have pepper sauce there. I was like, okay, cool. Now I know where I'm getting my pepper sauce from now on, and all of that. So, and then from there, it was it was more once, I think I said this earlier, was I started meeting Caribbean folks and Indo-Caribbean folks who were just also part of my other identities. And when I would talk to them, they would start to bring things up about, memories of growing up, or, some little thing, whether it's, how a certain auntie might make you feel or something, that one aunt that's just okay, I'm gonna let you say it because you're an elder and, respect your elders, but, yeah.
We all have those aunts.
And when you're having those conversations, that's really what brought me back to it. It was like, oh yeah, like this culture is more than just like food. It's more than just music. It's more than whatever. It's the ways that we relate to family. It's the ways that like we're loud when we speak, and like we don't bother to hide our passion for stuff. Like why bother hiding the fact that something is upsetting me right now? Like who's that helping? Like, and you know, like all of these little things where even sometimes you'll have these conversations and it'll be like, oh, I just realized like, yeah, there's this like auntie thing that we talk about all the time, but if you think about it in this way, that's like a very feminist thing that they're doing, you know, like there is this like, you know, my idea of the Kholi woman is, you know, that woman who is like loud and outspoken, and you know, yeah, she'll wash the dishes, but she's gonna let you know how she feels about the fact that she's washing the dishes and you're not, you know, like it's there's a lot of this like strong womanhood and Caribbean like and you know, for me, Indo-Caribbean identity that is just like meeting other Indo-Caribbean folks who embodied that, but also embodied other values that I had, was, yeah, really what drew me back into the culture and being like, yes, this is something I am proud of and want to, you know, acknowledge. There's this like whole history of things that we fought for, and, you know, like the respect that we needed to make people give us. And I think it's like a really valuable what you know, these lineages that we have brought us. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, remembering that that's sort of what is like the biggest part of culture. Like curry is great, but like remembering like why our curry is different than like East Indian curry is a big thing to remember.
Yeah, and I love how you beautifully put that. And I think I'm wondering for you in your exploration of identity, how did this affect your relationship with your parents? Like, did it bring you closer together? Like, how did that affect, or how did you navigate your relationship with your family while sort of figuring out your Indo-Caribbean identity and culture?
In some ways, it has brought me closer to, well, at least my mom. As I said, I am like pretty estranged from my dad. But in some ways, it brought me closer to his side of the family, or at least some of them. My godparents are actually his older sister and her husband, and they have uh, taken a big interest in my interest to like reconnect. You know, my uncle has been like texting me like little thing, like texted me the Wikipedia page for Guyana the other day, and I was like, I know how to use
We know
Wikipedia,
how to use
thank you. But this is very
but bless him,
sweet.
right? Like
You like
he's just
70-year-old man, like I understand. Like uh you know, it's you know, they were very much like, if you have any questions about you know, my that uncle is Vedic. My family is all like Christian converted, you know, from my grandparents and all that, but he's still Vedic. And when I told him I was interested in trying to like decolonize my relationship to religion and stuff like that, he was like very much like, have you know, you should read the Bhagavad Gita, you know, let's talk about this. And it was like, oh, like this is family that I thought I would never have a relationship with, you know, once I got out of the house. It was like, oh, I'm never gonna talk, why would I? But they're so excited to share that stuff with me that it's like, oh yeah, sure, like this is really great. And to be able to have like elders that you can talk to, even if, you know, it's not always problematic free. It's, you know, really great to have that connection. And then with my mom, it's been an actual like beautiful process for us. My mom was also, I think, really disconnected from culture because of like a lot of internalized racism and internalized colonialism that she was experiencing, having spent so much of her life here. Things like, yeah, I never knew to use coconut oil in my hair for like the longest time, because when my mom was growing up, she was made fun of for that kind of thing, you know, smelling like coconut oil and whatever in school, especially growing up, you know, in the 80s and whatever, you know, 70s, 80s time, and kids and teens and all of them. And there was a lot of things that she internalized about culture, about her own culture, you know, being backwards and all of this kind of thing, you know, associating it with poverty as well, and being like, oh, you can't have this culture and also be, you know, like not in poverty.
Yeah.
This sort of idea, being able to have these conversations with her now and sort of like deconstruct some of these ideas and help her reconnect with her own identity, and being like, this isn't something that I have to separate out from the parts of me I'm proud of. Like they're part of the parts of me that I'm proud of. And having those conversations, and even just being able to help her have those conversations with her own mom. We've been having this, you know, the Cups of Tea is very much based in this new relationship that we all have now, where I start asking questions, my mom starts asking questions, my grandmother is like, she's now asking questions because she's like, is this actually like a thing, you know, is this something I should know about? And it's just like, I really don't think I would have the relationship I have with my mom if I couldn't talk to her about our culture and things like that. Like, I think that is the major part of why we are close now.
Look at that, right? Like, and isn't that such a beautiful thing to know that there is something that, like, beyond all the crisis of having family, all the reasons why we may have to go to therapy for that, like, we can connect at this level of culture and it can bring us together. And I think it's so beautiful that some of your dad's family has reconnected with you, and sending Wikipedia page of Guyana, like, that is just so precious. But I'm so glad that it's been able to bring you a little bit closer to your family. So before we end off, I wanted to know, tell us a little bit more about how people can stay in touch with you and some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've got the Jumbie Podcast. It's got a Twitter and an Instagram and all of that at Jumbie Pod. It's also on, you know, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's on most of the directories, I believe. And so subscribe to that. You can find me on Instagram here with this handle, or on Twitter, but there's no underscore for Twitter. It's just Murky Waters. And there's my website, indivisibleWriting.com. It's sort of my portfolio page, where every few months I remember to update it and dump a bunch of links in. But you can find a lot of my other types of work and stuff there, and all the different kinds of conversations I take part in.
Awesome. And so before we end off, I want to just, again, thank you for being here, Deb, and sharing your story. I think it's really important for people to hear various stories of, and it's been such a great joy for me to sit down with so many people sharing their stories. And never once have I sat down where one person's story is the same as another. Everybody's story is unique, and I think it's been really great for all of us to learn and to see how identity affects us in all various ways. So before we end off, I want to ask you a little bit more about, you know, say there's someone out there that's sort of having a little bit of trouble navigating identity, especially in the context of these other underrepresented identities, you know, transgender, disabled, non-binary, whatever else that, you know, we don't see in Indo-Caribbean culture as much as we should. What would you say to them? What advice would you have for them?
I guess it's like, keep like persisting and finding those people. Like, you're gonna find your people. If you just keep being yourself, like, loudly, they come to you eventually, is what I'm learning. Is I just like go post photos of myself online, and then folks are like, hey, I'm also someone like you. And I'm like, great, cool, let's hang out. So eventually, like, the internet is such a great tool. You can connect to so many amazing folks who are in these similar spaces, especially if you aren't in a, an area like Toronto or New York where, there's so many of us around in close proximity. But, the internet can be like a very valuable tool, and just remember that, like, there is no monolith of Indo-Caribbean culture. If you're meeting folks who just like aren't jiving with you, like, that's okay. That just means, like, if we were all back home, we just wouldn't be friends. Like, we'd all be in our own little cliques or whatever, and you just got to find who would be part of your clique if, you were all together.
Amazing. Deb, I just want to thank you too for claiming the Indo-Caribbean identity, the Caribbean identity. And I hope that, you feel received by majority of the community. And I think it's important that you claim it, because I feel like there's a little person that's out there that's going to see this and going to be like, oh, I relate to this so much, right? And I think that's one of the things that, for me personally, I didn't see myself in other Indo-Caribbean people, so I imagine others would probably feel the same. And so you being, you claiming your identity as who you are with the titles that you have, storyteller, producer, non-binary, transgender, all these identities that you have, and to see, and for someone to see you and to see you speak and to have you here and to listen to you, I think is such a gift. So thank you. Thank you for claiming it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. I'm so looking forward to listening more with these Jumbie stories. I have to listen to Faux Wines. I seen that it came out, so.
It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday? So
yes.
What was episode 2? Who was with episode 2?
That's Patrick Salvini or Miss Nikki Galore. They're actually Filipino. They are talking about their story is called Pasalubong, but the monster itself is called the Kumukatuk. So
Nice.
It's a really great story. Features queer and trans characters just like doing their horror thing, which is just like, I didn't even realize how like amazing it would be just to listen to a story where there is somebody with they them pronouns screaming in terror, like, it's like, hey, I could be screaming in terror in this story too.
That's so funny.
But yeah, that's Santo Tricks on IG. Amazing drag queen, amazing storyteller, also doing a lot of work in like racialized horror spaces and connecting with horror that way. So yeah, also recommend their work. We've also got Joan Rupram coming up on episode 4, Miss Tanya Liu, who is a Jamaican storyteller. On episode 5, I'm going to talk about John Konu a little bit. I can't even say it properly. I'm like, the emphasis is all wrong. I know. But yeah, an amazing lineup of folks, and I'm just like really excited to get to hear more Jumbie stories. And we are looking for a few more slots to fill for recording in the new year. So if you want to share a Jumbie story, send me a DM or email me. Yeah.
Amazing. And I love the diversity that you're having on Jumbie Podcast. So I'm really looking forward to it. Again, Deb, thank you for being here. Thank you for being you. Thank you for making me laugh, because I laugh when I see some of your posts. So
thank you.
I appreciate you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for giving me the space and that showing that my words have value. It does mean a lot to me.
Of course. And we'll end off with Shabita's comments. She said, "This was such a beautiful conversation. Thank you and blessings." So thank you all so much for joining us. Until next time. Bye.